Hello everyone, it's Dr. Feist again talking to you about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and we're still putting our way through Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and today we're looking at Chapter 6. In this video, it's going to be Chapter 6, Part A. There will be a number of parts, so in this first bit, I just want to give the opening sort of layout. So if you recall from the previous video, on Chapter 5, we looked at a number of candidates. So, if you recall, we had 4 lives, and each of these lives offered a candidate or two for this best good that we've been calling eudaimonia. Remember, we're not translating that term, but roughly happiness, flourishing. So, these 4 candidates, we saw that Aristotle tested them out, and he rejected them not outright, in the sense of saying, oh, they've got nothing to do with eudaimonia, but he rejected them as candidates to identify with eudaimonia. So remember, for example, the hoi polloi, when they were talking about hedone as being, like pleasure, being the greatest good, the eudaimonia for a human being, he said, no, we're not going to identify eudaimonia with that. We're going to say something like, well, pleasure is part of the story, but it shouldn't be regarded as the whole story of eudaimonia. And then in the charantes and the practicos and whatnot, they offered things like time, honor, or arete, kind of virtue or excellence. He said, well, that's not quite right to identify with eudaimonia either, because remember, the notion of eudaimonia is fixed and stable. And Aristotle said, we can't really prove that, but that's just something that we just think, the greatest good for you is not something that's going to be just handed to you or just simply taken away. So thinking about the greatest good, as he says back in Chapter 5, it has to be something stable. And time and arete, while they may be stable in some ways, especially arete, you could have all kinds of arete, and if no one recognizes it, you could live a life of misery, be this really virtuous person that's living a life of misery. Aristotle thinks that's possible, which is why he doesn't want to identify eudaimonia and arete or any of the others. So we're getting a bit more of an idea as to what he doesn't think eudaimonia is, all these different candidates. But we're going to continue on. And in this chapter, this is probably one of the toughest chapters in the book, if not the entire Nicomachean Ethics, because here Aristotle, shall we say, is starting to take it up a notch. Because in the earlier versions, or the earlier chapters, he was looking at particular candidates, right, for eudaimonia, arete, or time, or, hedone, whatever. So very particular candidates. In Chapter 6 now, so Chapter 6, he's going to look at a general notion of good. Previously, he was looking at particular notions of good as candidates for eudaimonia. Now he's going to look at a more general notion of good, and this is going to tie into the views of the Platonists. Now, I want to make a couple of comments here. Aristotle says, okay, we're going to be moving from the practical to the more general notion of good, and by general, really what you can sort of read is a much more abstract notion. So we're going to be starting to do a little bit more heavy-duty philosophy here. Rather than just canvassing opinions, Aristotle is going to dig into an analysis here that's going to involve Plato's notions of forms and Aristotle's understanding of logic. And what understanding does he have of logic? Well, we're going to pull a little bit of that out of a book, a different book totally by Aristotle, from the Categories. And I'll give you a little summary of what's going on there. So we need a little bit more philosophical material to handle this. Now, arguably, you could you could more or less skip all the details of chapter 6 and still have a good idea as to what Aristotle's up to in the Nicomachean Ethics. But if you really want to have a solid understanding of how much Aristotle accepts from Plato and how much he rejects, you really have to take the time and plow your way through chapter 6. Tough, but rewarding. So, all right, back to this. Now, general abstract notion of good. That's what our new candidate is. Views expressed by the Platonists and, of course, headed by Aristotle's old teacher, Plato. Aristotle comes to the academy as a young man, about 17 years of age, comes from the countryside, born in Stagira, comes to Athens. It's the big center of study, and he studies with the Platonists. He studies with Plato. He knew Plato. And he says, well, looks like when we examine this, we're going to have to, just to jump ahead, we're going to be rejecting this position. And this means we're going to be rejecting the position held by Platonists, by Plato, our friends. And Aristotle makes an interesting comment here. He says that since we're friends with the author of these views, or the theory of ideas, right? And we'll look a little bit more about what we mean by ideas. Another word is forms. We're going to have to criticize people, Aristotle says, who are our friends. And he says, but that's part and parcel of where our duties lie. We have certain kinds of duties. Aristotle says, for Aristotle, the duty that we have is not just to our friends. We have duties to friends, but ultimately the duty is to truth. So we may have to break with our friends. We may have to go against what they say in order to discharge properly our duty to truth. Now, is Aristotle right about this? Again, I want you to read and think about these writings of Aristotle very critically. Do we really have a greater duty to truth than our friends? We haven't even really talked about what truth is. So what is that? You're putting that, think about it, in a very concrete way. Somebody's saying you have a greater duty to some notion or concept like truth than you do to your friends. Is that really the case? Is that really true? How does that work? How would we justify that? That is a claim. You could argue against it. And some people today do argue against that. For example, Richard Rorty, the great thinker in sort of an analytic postmodernist type thought, says that this is not the case, right? That we don't have greater duties to some abstract notion of truth. Our duties are to other people. That's where true duties lie. And think about it just as sort of a simple example, as I often tell my students, if your friend rolls in, is all excited about a haircut, and you're thinking to yourself, ooh, that didn't go well, and then asks you, what do you think? Right? Do you have a great duty to truth to say exactly what you think? That's the truth of what you think. You may not be right, but the truth of the question, what do you think, would be that you would say, well, I don't like it, or it looks terrible. Do you do that? Do you have a greater duty to do that than to say to your friend something else, change the subject, or perhaps say a falsehood? All right. So this isn't an easy question. Also, think about this. When Socrates got into trouble with the Athenian authorities, and they were telling him, you either stop doing what you're doing. I don't want to go into the whole story, but Socrates was more or less threatened with a capital punishment. He knew what was going to happen if he were convicted of the charges. And then he was offered a way out. His friends and many people wanted him to just simply leave Athens, right? They wanted him out. They didn't want to have to kill him, but they were going to if he stayed. And so he refused to leave and went along the lines of a duty to truth. Now, think about this. Socrates knew full well, and you can read it in various dialogues, especially the Phaedo, that Socrates was aware that if he stayed in Athens and fought the charges, which he did, you can read about that in the Apology, and was completely ironically it's called the apology, but Socrates was completely unapologetic, as a matter of fact, insisting that he should be rewarded for what he did rather than punished. He was convicted, and he knew that if that were to happen, he knew that his wife and his children would suffer a terrible fate if he were removed from the picture. They could be sold into slavery or suffer for decades of extreme poverty. He knew that. So, did he make the right decision? He chose to stay. He discharged his duty to the truth. Now, what would we say about someone who did that? If they could simply flee from the charges and then take their family somewhere else and go live in Syracuse or another city and survive, but no, chose to stay and perished. And as far as I know, we really don't know what happened to his wife and children. But overall, it probably was not a happy fate after the death of Socrates. Was that the right decision? Think about Aristotle himself, saying we have this duty to truth. But when it was his turn, almost like philosophers were taking turns getting into trouble with the Athenian authorities, he didn't stay. He left. He got out of there and went out into the countryside and lived for several years after, because at a certain time in Athens, there were a lot of complaints and a lot of xenophobia was raging, and Aristotle was threatened with possible punishment, maybe even capital punishment too. And he simply left. So I want you to think about this, about duties to truth and what Aristotle says here, when he arguably didn't even do it himself. Is Aristotle being a bit of a hypocrite here? Or do we have to contextualize this notion of a duty to truth? Yes, but only in an abstract sense or whatnot. As it stands, it's just a global statement. It could be contested. It's not self-evident. All right, so that lays a little bit of the groundwork. In the next video, I want to go into a little more detail in terms of the background of Plato's theory of forms, so we have a better idea of what the totality of chapter 6 is about, namely Aristotle's criticisms of the Platonic notions of forms. So, stay tuned for a discussion of what Plato means by the theory of ideas.